Hello everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this evening for this very special webinar. My name's Jane Vadivelou and I'm the CEO of Children's Ground. I'd firstly like to acknowledge the beautiful lands and the countries upon which I am sitting this evening, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to recognise their ancestors that are still here looking after these lands, the elders past, present and future, the children who have lived on these lands for generations and will continue to generations to come. I want to thank the Wurundjeri people for looking after these lands for so long and recognise how lucky I am to be living here now. I'd also like to pass over to Felicity Hayes, traditional owner for Mbantua, Alice Springs, to welcome you to her country where she is this evening.
Oda Renee Phillips Hayes, Angala, a young Mbantua, a young worker in my children's ground, a young translator, and author. I'd like to acknowledge all my families, custodians of this land, and all people that passed on that taught me a lot about country and culture and language. I also like to acknowledge all the other First Nations people in Australia and for all the great leaders that was before us and wants us to do what we are doing now, teaching our children language and culture and to keep it strong for our next generation. We're going to make First Nations education to be recognized in Australia, that we do have a lot of knowledge. And I like to acknowledge the old people as, has been there for us all the time and teaching us. And who now is like the ancestors are here to help us too, Kala.
Thank you so much, Felicity. And thank you all for joining us this evening. It's just wonderful to have so many of you with us tonight. We're going to have a very wonderful, important conversation about why Australia should have a First Nations-led education system recognised and supported across these beautiful lands of Australia. We have an incredible panel. The first person who I'm so deeply honoured to introduce you to is Veronica Dobson. Veronica is a cultural professor and elder. She is a knowledge holder of extreme importance for Arrernte people and for First Nations people across these countries, and I would say internationally. She's a linguist and educator. She's pioneered for national education reform for years and years. She's worked with so many organisations and individuals, including CSIRO and many, many projects in the areas of Indigenous environmentalism, education, and also First Nations knowledge systems in healing and wellbeing. She's a published author. This is one of her books. It's a magnificent book for those of you who want to understand more about language, culture, medicines, knowledge. This is a book that Veronica published many, many years ago. She was also instrumental in creating the first Arrernte dictionary many, many years ago. This work is pioneering work that was started, 40 to 50 years ago in Central Australia and undertaken by and led by Veronica and others in Central Australia. And we're so fortunate to have her tonight on the panel. She's joined next to her by her amazing and wonderful daughter, Camille Dobson, who's an Arrernte woman, a lawyer, and she's the operations coordinator at Children's Ground. Camille's worked for the Aboriginal legal rights movement for 4 years as a native title case manager and spent 10 years at the University of Adelaide in the Wiltja Yalu Aboriginal programs as a lecturer, and is a founding member and public officer of the Watpu Mayunu, the South Australian Indigenous Lawyers and Law Students Association. You've heard from Felicity Hayes, wonderful traditional owner from Mbantua, Alice Springs, and senior Arrernte educator. Over the years, Felicity has worked tirelessly as an educator and pushed for the privileging of Arundel language and culture within formal education systems. She was the first employee of Children's Ground in Central Australia and one of the co-directors of Children's Ground there. She's a grandmother and she forms the backbone of the Children's Ground Cultural Governance Committee. Renee Phillips is a Saibai woman from Zenith Kes. I'm just learning myself through Renee. Zenith Kes is known to other people as the Torres Strait. She is an educator, a Western trained educator, as well as a first cultural knowledge holder. She's a co-founder of the National Indigenous Youth Education Coalition, which is a fantastic network of young people looking for education reform. She's currently studying a master's degree in Indigenous education and is a proud advocate for seeing education reform. Rachel Naninaaq Edwardson is a Nuppiat filmmaker, educator, and producer of In My Blood It Runs. She's worked in Native education reform across Alaska and led educational initiatives in Australia and visited many places around the world in her work. Rachel has also worked alongside education reform colleagues in Hawaii, Canada, and Aotearoa, New Zealand. We're so fortunate to have this incredible expertise on this panel. I want to also recognise the wonderful film In My Blood It Runs, for which we are a partner, and we're hosting this as a joint partner event this evening. Tonight we're going to speak about we're going to look at three main questions. We're going to look at what is First Nations education, why is it important, what is happening here in Australia and across the world, and we're also then going to speak about what people can do to take action. But we recognise that this is the first conversation for many who have not had the opportunity to understand the depth and beauty and the sustained education knowledge systems that have been across these lands for over 65,000 years. So I'm going to open up my first question to our most senior elder with great respect and love, Veronica. Could you please just speak to our audience about what First Nations education is?
Well, First Nation education is how I learned with my grandparents, travelling around on country, getting to know what type of plants and even the land itself. Also learning about the kin and skin system and how everybody relates, and also looking after the waters that were there before time. You know, the people used to use a lot of the waters on the land before cattle and that was brought on country and made into cattle stations and stuff like that. And also learning a lot about how we relate to land as well. The kin and skin is really important to our people, and the language and the culture. The identity of our people is the language and culture. That's the reason why it is very important for us to continue to teach our children a lot of that stuff that was taught to us by our grandparents and other families.
Thank you so much, Veronica. No, it's wonderful. Felicity, could you talk a little bit also a bit further about what First Nations education is from your perspective?
I think First Nations education is vital for the survival of language and culture for the next generation. So we're trying to get our children to learn about, instead of learning about history, we want to learn history about our people, you know, how we survived and still surviving today. So we want to teach our children our language and culture and preserve it for the next generation.
Yeah, thank you. Renee, a lot of people who are watching, and some people will know that these knowledge systems, education systems continue to exist around Australia. And I certainly have watched people like Veronica teaching people over the last 20 or 30 years. these knowledge systems. Can you speak from your perspective as a younger generation Saibai woman, what First Nations education means to you?
In terms of what First Nations education means to me, it's one that it's an education that is grounded in our lands, grounded in our waters, particularly for Islander women. The sea is very much a huge teacher, but it's one that is education that is delivered in our first language. And it is basically, it honors the passing of knowledges from our ancestors to generations after generations. It's sustaining, and it ensures basically our survival and how resilient we are. And to this day, it is the one that has enabled us to be the longest continuous culture in the world.
Thank you. Rachel, I want to ask you, as somebody that's worked in First Nations education, both within Australia and internationally, I know a lot of people might say, well, why do you need a First Nations or if you have a First Nations education system, what about all the other knowledge? What is First Nations education? Can you speak to people about what it actually is?
Thank you, Jane, and thank you again for having me here. And I'm just very honored to be sitting amongst this panel with all the wisdom and strength that you guys hold. And I've been very lucky as a foreigner, coming from Alaska, and as a First Nations person from another country, to have been so welcomed into these lands, into all of the countries that I've worked across Australia, all of the different First Nations countries, and the leaders and elders and strength of their continued sovereignty and resilience. And I think that has been such a benefit to guide me on any of the work that I've done. So I just wanted to start off by acknowledging that all the guidance that we've had. And I think, in having this conversation, I know a lot of our audience members will have come through the work of Children's Ground and through the film In My Blood It Runs, which really tells the story of the impact on our children, on our First Nations children, of education systems which are not, in which we have not provided a culturally safe foundation for them through, through a whole lot of reasons. But just to come back, I think, to that question of what is First Nations education, and to kind of remember to look at what the connection between culture and education is I think the starting point for us understanding what a First Nations led education system looks like. And I think when those of us who make up, pretty much all of us who are raised in an education system which came from a particular cultural knowledge system and cultural pedagogy of understanding of what learning and growing is for our children, it's very hard for us to break out and understand that education is simply a means to become a productive, functioning member of a particular society and a particular college group, right? And the culture that you use to educate a child is vitally important. It is vitally important that vehicle for education is in line with what their culture is. So First Nations led education is the same thing as education is for any other cultural group. And therein lies this conversation about it being a human right, that education is really a means to help grow and teach and learn our children, so that we are passing on all of the things that the previous panelists talk about, passing on these knowledge systems, passing on this language, passing on history, passing on science, passing on stories, passing on ecological knowledge, all of these things that our ancestors and our elders have had and have fought so hard for us to have. And so First Nations led education is simply saying, on the same fundamental right that any community or any culture or any society in the world has to educate their children in who they are and how their society functions, First Nations communities have that same right. And what that looks like is then led and guided by people such as your panelists. So I think that's probably a larger description. But I think it's important to start with understanding what education is first and how it's connected to culture. And that then allows us to see that these education systems are complete pedagogies. It's not just language, it's not just painting and artwork, it's not just dance, it's actually an entire way of looking and being and thinking about the world.
Thank you, Rachel. Veronica, I have watched you over many years teaching both Aranda children, but also non-Aboriginal children in a very sort of beautiful way around, you know, at times I've been one of your students where I've sat and you've been teaching, for example, about bush medicines or and you've been using the earth, you know, and parts of the earth to show and to teach the story about how people are healed or how bush medicines are used or what happens when somebody is sick and what happens, what the right processes are and what the right medicines are and what the right protocols are. Can you maybe reflect a little bit more about your learnings as a child growing up through your ancestors and how you carry that teaching on today?
Well, you know, the people that you live with, I've always lived with my grandparents, and they are the ones that give me the knowledge in how to, you know which plants that can be used for as a medicine, and how people heal their sick and that. It was more or less trial and error where our people used those things. What worked, they continued to use, and what didn't work, they didn't use. So, you know, a lot of that stuff was taught to me and other younger people when we traveled the country, you know, and learned a lot about the plants, also the animals, whatever the land held, and of course the actual land is part of us, and we belong to the land, and how the land gives you what you need, and looked after the waters. They told us stories at night about the stars and things like that.
So I think that's one of the parts of the education systems the education system, as you say, comes from the land. Everything comes from the land, doesn't it? So the education, the knowledge, the relationships, the kinship. So for people that don't, a lot of non-Aboriginal people probably don't understand just how profoundly important the land is to everything. It's the starting point for education. Do you and Camille want to speak a little bit more about how important the land is as the foundation for education?
Well, the kin and skin is what upholds the laws of the land and the laws of the people of the land. It's like the town laws of the city laws, and that's what we abided by and still do. But we live in both worlds. So, you got to teach the young children how land is important to them and what's on the land is important to them, especially our young kids, because they're starting to lose a lot of that, and they need to come back and sit down on the ground level with us and learn about it. And also they're losing the language. That's the reason why we continue to want to teach them how to use the language in a way, and we start doing dictionaries and other books and stuff like that for them to learn from, to continue to, they can hold the language strongly and dearly to their hearts and, not lose it. They can speak English for all they want, but they still got their own language, and that's their identity. They shouldn't forget that.
Yeah, look, it's an amazing body of work in your life that you've contributed to education. So, you know, for people to think that Aranda hadn't been written down before you did all the orthography and all the work for the dictionary, and recognise that this was a danger is the loss of language and the importance of holding the language for future identity. You know, with people being taken off their land and removed from their land, and land being the foundation of identity and law. And I think for those of you who are watching, when people talk about Aranda law or Aboriginal law, that law is a very strict law. And it continues today. It's not something from the past. It continues very strongly through people's responsibilities to land and to kinship and to people and to society. And you, I get, you know, what was it? You know, you saw this maybe 40 years ago when you started to write the dictionary and the orthography of the dictionary, this incredible work to, you know, putting this oral language into a written form.
Yeah, well, the language has to be written, so the young people that haven't got the language can always go back to it and say, this is the language where it originally came from. As you know, the language has changed pretty rapidly now. There's a mixture of English as well as people marrying into other groups. And, you know, the language changed pretty rapidly. And there's at least something that they can go back to identify themselves from, which language they originally came from as well.
Yeah, thank you. Camille, did you want to add anything?
Probably the important thing about the language and land is that, you know, like without the land, you can't tell the stories of the country, and you know the language is really important in telling the story of the country, because you can't tell the same story in English; it just doesn't work. So, you know, it's really like it's all very tightly wrapped up, I think, in you know everything in land. I suppose the work that Mum's done over the years, and there's been a lot of it done over the years, is about trying to make sure that the language has longevity and that there's preservation of the language. And at one point there, it did look, I mean, the Aranda language was being classified as being an endangered language. And like so many other Aboriginal languages across, you know, Australia, they've been either lost or, you know, very highly impacted by colonisation. And, you know, it's very hard to reclaim a language once it gets to a point. So, you know, even though, you know, it's written in an English form, the Aranda language, it's a way of trying to keep that, you know, language a little bit, I suppose, stable and a bit pure, and also, you know, a nod to the old, you know, the older language, the old Aranda language, because now, you know, we're noticing that more and more Aranda words are being, you know, anglicised, or, you know, there's a lot of English creeping into the Aranda language, and people prefer to use some of the English words that they've just Arandaized. So it's a real concern, and, you know, it's all part of like the education process and keeping things, you know, like at least giving kids the option to learn the old language and then make their mind up about what they want to do with that, whether they're, you know, going to use the more modern take on the Aranda language or not. Yeah.
That's really great. And I think for those of you who are watching, there are, you know, over 350 languages and more and dialects spoken across Australia. And Australia was a land of different nations, just as places like Europe and other places were, discrete and different nations with different languages. Today, there are only 13 languages that are being taught between generations, across generations. So we are in a time within Australia where these oldest living languages and knowledge systems around the world that are held in these languages are under serious threat. And Aranda, which is one of the languages, you know, which is the language of Veronica and Camille and Felicity, that's one of those languages. But even within that, it's considered to be a stronger language because it's being passed down. But as Veronica has said and MK Turner have said, they've been very worried for a number of years because the change of language is happening. The language holds the content and the structures and the laws and the knowledge systems. Everything is held within those languages. We're seeing languages around Australia being revived, which is absolutely wonderful to watch, but we want to hold these important languages. I'm going to go to the next question, and I'm going to reference the film In My Blood It Runs. And for those of you who haven't seen the film yet, it's out on iView at the moment. It is a most fantastic film that gives a beautiful insight into the story and the life of Dwan as a 10-year-old child living in Alice Springs and then up on his traditional homelands in Borroloola, and the challenges that he faced walking this very fine line between the strength of his culture and his family and his land, and the challenges he faced against the mainstream education system, the welfare system and the prison systems. And for those of you who haven't seen the film, I really encourage you to watch it on iView. One of the things that, Dwan faces is this challenge at school. And it leads me to the next question, which is, why is First Nations-led education so important when we see a story like Dwan's? Renee, could you speak to that?
Yeah. So I guess, talking, from a young First Nations perspective, it's important to have a First Nations-led education system because, we have the ability to exercise our right to determine and establish our own First Nations education system, as outlined in Article 14 of the United Declarations of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. For far too long, our people have had to assimilate into white colonial structures and institutions. And basically these institutions, in their establishment since the time of colonization, our people were never invited to the table to actually have those discussions of what does education look like for our people? What is education in terms of First Nations people? And, the sophisticated educational practices that existed before the time of colonization were ignored or not acknowledged. Sorry, excuse me. Like, how are you able to have a culture that is the longest continuous culture in the world without an education knowledge system that ensured, the survival and resilience of people, of that community, of that nation? As a First Nations person, it's integral that we have access to being taught and learning our first languages, our culture, that unfortunately that our, older people were denied of. And, in terms of thinking about, I guess, what the First Nations education system looks like, we really need to abandon and deconstruct the colonial ideas of what education is, and even the system. And that comes down to the curriculum, however you want to call it. What is exactly that our young First Nations people should be taught? It comes down to the pedagogy. How is that teaching delivered? It should be delivered in first language. Even comes down to the school leadership. It's not just one person that governs that school, for example. It doesn't just stand with one principal. It is the whole community. It is our elders sitting at that, and then that whole community of that young First Nations person's family being a part of that educational journey. And we really need to think about, what does a school even look like? Like, we need to think beyond the brick walls, the roof. We need to think beyond roles. We need to think beyond timetabling and even bells, because these things are very similar to what's happening in prisons, and we need to really disabandon that. Sorry, I went onto a rant, but anyway.
Felicity, what do you think might have been different for Dwan? Dwan's, part of your, he's a young fella, part of your extended families. If he had been within a First Nations education system, how might things have been different for him in education?
Dwan was our voice, working or being with these families and learning things. I think he grew up to be a good man, because here in countries, it is a big classroom for us. Because we was taught, when we was at school, we was taught in classrooms, but on the weekends we was taken out by grandparents. Got taught language and culture, birds, trees, waters, and how to survive and to keep our language and culture strong. And I think he was a bit like me when I used to, in beach when I went to school. I used to just look out the window and get bored listening to Captain Cook stories, you know. So I thought that reminded a bit of me. It was like boring. So I can't our children learn about our culture and history, stories about our people. So I think he was thinking the way that we all think, you know, we need to have a education system to get recognized and to be implemented to the national curriculum.
Thank you. Rachel, why is it important?
I think there's one very simple answer for that, why it's important. And I think everybody has sort of laid all this beautiful grounding and in-depth reason for it. But ultimately, the reason it's important, and it's going to sound like a very self-assured answer, but it's backed up by international, national evidence across every single aspect of a child's growth and development. And that is First Nations-led education is important because it is the one thing that is going to work for First Nations children. It will work across everything that all the other panelists have said. It's going to work across their intellectual growth and development, their spiritual growth and development, and their cultural and community and societal growth and development. And it is the one thing that's missing from our puzzle piece right now. I think we try so many different things in our education system. And in my other hat, you know, other than filmmaking, I've been very lucky to work in various different education systems all over the world. And I've seen really well-intentioned programs, really programs with lots of funding, programs with little funding, programs with a lot of thought behind them, with all kinds of specialists behind them. And each one of those programs impacts this tiny little area and maybe has a good impact for a short while, and then it mostly peters off. But First Nations education, because of its complexity, because of its continued existence, because of the strength of the people themselves who have held this space through colonization, through everything else, it has all of the pieces that our children need, right? And so speaking very directly, you know, for if there is a lot of the audience who watched the film In My Blood It Runs, you know, this film, as I mentioned before, shows us the impact of when our education system does not have a First Nations education option for First Nations children. But the other thing that the film shows us, and this really speaks to the heart of the work of Children's Ground and NIAC and the amazing leadership and elders and educators that you've got on screen and that we've got behind you on the ground, it speaks to the fact that this system of education and this knowledge system that, you know, the elders with us today and the elders not with us today have worked so hard to hold for their children is continuing, it exists right alongside what's happening outside of all of our school gates on Indigenous country. And so our key to the success for our children and to making that work is sitting there. It's not something that we need to recreate. It's not something that we need some specialist from overseas or some specialists in childhood development to do. Our specialists are there on the ground. Our specialists are these elders on the screen. Our specialists are in these communities. And that's the work that really drove a lot of the reason In My Blood It Runs even exists as a film and a project. But it's this continued journey of work that you talked about. And so I think the reason it's important is, one, you know, you have all the human rights arguments for it. You have all the brain science and childhood development arguments for it. But ultimately, the reasons it's important that we put our energy behind those on the ground who've held this space for First Nations educational pedagogies is because it is the one thing that's going to work for First Nations children. And it's the one thing that's missing from our system right now.
Thank you so much. And I think, you know, for those of you who are watching who might, you know, have heard about Closing the Gap and the efforts of government and the investment over all these years, and people who, so many things have been supported. But one of the things that we say at Children's Ground is so much of the efforts to date, as our speakers are saying, have been put into downstream solutions. So dealing with crises, we're watching our kids falling into prisons. And as William Tillmouth our chairperson says, this conveyor belt that children are born and their trajectory too often is into the hands of the child protection system or into the hands of, into the prison system or into a failed education system, or education system doesn't work for them, and then ultimate sort of stress and de-stress through life. And we're really, one of the things that I think our speakers are speaking to is that First Nations-led education is the ultimate prevention to those things. We have not invested in it in this country. We have not allowed children the right to enter education systems where they will succeed, which honour their cultures and identities, which are founded on their futures and their families. And that's the investment that we want to see in this by our governments. And we really are seeking the support of many of you who are watching today to understand that these systems of education exist, that this is where we need our investment. As William says, not an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, but the investment in our children from the day of their birth through the education systems that are defined by them and their families, and they've been always part of their knowledge systems for life. This takes me to the next question, which is, what is actually happening? I mean, I know, we will speak a little bit about the work of Children's Ground and Naninaaq. We'll also speak about Uchera Pampa, which is the First Nations Educators Network, and also what's happening more globally. So I might start with Felicity and Camille. Felicity, you've been leading a lot of the education reform that's led by Children's Ground as a first cultural educator. Could you speak to people about what you were doing at Children's Ground in leading First Nations-led education and the impact that's having for children?
Well, at the moment, I've been working at children, taking them out on country, teaching them about the trees and the fruits, and to look for honey ants and stuff like that. When you do live out in the desert, you have to learn to survive and to look at all these trees and how to find water and stuff like that, and teach children how to track.
And can you speak about the sort of curriculum that you've articulated, the onto curriculum?
Do you understand again?
The curriculum.
I'm lost there.
That's okay. I'll pass over to Camille and Veronica to speak to that a bit, and we can come back to you.
Yeah.
That's fine, Felicity.
Yeah.
Camille, can you speak a little bit about what's happening at Children's Ground, or Veronica?
So at Children's Ground, basically we've got a curriculum that has been developed by the First Nations staff to teach the kids. So basically at the centre of it is the kids, and then it comes out to the next circle, which is family, and then you've got community. So it's a holistic approach to looking at, how we can engage with, the First Nations kids and keep them interested in learning and keep the family involved in the learning. So it's just not, one teacher and a whole group of kids. It's actually having families involved in the learning for kids, and their in turn learning as well. So, there's a lot of written narunda. So families are coming in and interacting with their written narunda. So they're learning a little bit about how to write and read language while they're also teaching their kids. So it's this really nice approach, I think, to get that involvement. And then the next circle out the community. So people from Children's Ground work out of different town camps in Alice Springs and run their programs there, and pretty much anyone's welcome to come along and participate. And we get a lot of families coming in. They might come in once or twice, or they might come in, 10 times in a year or 50 times in a year. So it's very flexible, and just encouraging people to come in and participate in the learning that Children's Ground do. A lot of the learning takes place out on country. So we take we get all the kids and families in buses and take them out bush, and they go out and learn about, they might learn about jarpa, which is the widgety grub, and all the different ones, and they go and look for jarpa that day, and so it's a whole experience. It's and there's stories around jarpa, and teaching kids a little bit about the language. Well, something's happened. Sorry, we've just gone to the visuals. So yeah, it's trying to do it so it's a community involvement, family involvement, and children involvement, and there's a lot of support for all of those people living in town camps to come and participate. So it's a bit more involved than just going to school and having one teacher teach at the front of the class, and kids getting lost in the background, and and also kids have voice. We encourage kids to speak and to contribute, and we also learn a lot from kids every day. So it's not a one-way learning system.
I think that's really important, is that this is a system of education that's been around for a long time, and at Children's Ground we're re-establishing that system that comes from the land. So in the locations that we work in Central Australia and the top end, that it's the right teachers for that particular land that are teaching those particular children. And we're starting from early childhood, so that we start with little kids from the time of their birth right through, that they can be privileged in education in their first language and their first culture. Felicity, did you want to add anything else to that about starting with the little ones and growing up with them?
Starting with the little ones and like supporting kids when they go to school, into the mainstream schools, and also getting family involved, taking the children out bush and showing them the country, and looking at bush foods and looking at what type of trees that children can look for fruits, and looking into the ground and following tracks to find where these animals are, even digging for water in the creeks. It's like getting old people and young people together, getting involved with the children's learning.
Yeah, fantastic. So it's intergenerational.
Yes, intergenerational,
connecting little ones with elders and young people and adults. And following some key areas of learning outcomes that you're wanting to see around children and their health and their well-being. And one of the things that you spoke about, Felicity, that you made sure was in this sort of learning outcome was, independence, kids being independent, their connection, their utnanga, their spirit, their ability to be independent. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Well, with our children, we have like a lot of people looking after this one child, and this one child is supported in every way. Like there's a lot of people there to look after that child, and that child is got to look healthy, to have a good spirit, and to know the knowledge of the country, to be connected. And we got the old people and the young people that are also learning about language and culture, and there's many people involved in that child's learning.
So it's not a single teacher. Veronica, can you talk to us a little bit about the relationship of, about utnanga and education and the land for kids as they're growing up?
Well, utnanga does on the land, and it belongs to certain people wherever the land is, and people are normally always happy to go back there, and they interact with their spirits on the land, and that's where we would always like to go back home and interact with our people that have passed on, as well as the land itself, and it gives us everything the land does. You know, as you know, the language and knowledge comes from the land. Also, it's always there every time you go back.
Why is that important for the children to grow? What, you know, what do you, when you see the kids now going back out onto country through children's ground, why is that important from your perspective?
Well, we talk about the land. I've taken some students from Santa Teresa out there a fair few times to the springs and that, and I talk to them about the land and how the land belongs to certain people, you know, and you know, I tell them a lot about how people lived in the early times before Europeans came and used the waters, the food, you know, whatever that was on the land.
Mm.
And I call the actual springs and that our ancestral waters, because they were waters that people used before taps and bores came to be. And I give them, you know, the information of how, you know, the stories go through land as well, different stories, because I talked about the rainmakers, and it's always been Kamara Porola, that's skin group, the rain people, that belongs to the rain dreaming. And I show them things like plants and that, and also we do a lot of stuff with the children by collecting the little critters that live in the water as well. And we talk about the names of the little critters, and they take that back to the school and identify it on their computers and that.
Mm.
Also, you know, we give them bits of papers with the little critters on there. Some don't belong to those waters, some do. And those little critters tell you whether the water's bad, good, or indifferent.
Mm.
And they learn a lot about that, because every time we take them out there, they seem to be happy to do what their schoolwork. You know, it's learning both ways rather than just learning, you know, in English all the time in the classroom.
Mm.
That's how we learn. You know, our school was out on country, not indoors.
Mm. So we're speaking about, you know, sort of there are two different systems that are happening. One is a system that's sort of sitting within children's ground and really privileging that first language and culture as a part of the education system. And you're also speaking to the important work done at places like Santa Teresa and other community schools, where there's this great sort of engagement of first cultural educators in the mainstream education, but taking the kids out and then coming back in and doing some of that work back in the school school context. And I think it's important to note that there are so many first cultural educators around the country, either leading First Nations education or have been part of the bilingual system of education over many, many years, you know, places like Yirrkala or the Walpri Education Training Triangle, who have been, you know, at the forefront of First Nations education in many ways. Renee, I wanted to ask you if you could speak a little bit about the work of NIAQ.
Yeah, so NIAQ is National Indigenous Youth Education Coalition. It's a collective of young First Nations people who got together in 2015 and basically said, look, we got to advocate for our right to determine our own First Nations education system under the guidance of the United Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, Article 14. And basically, we want to build a community of young First Nations people to have our voice heard and basically to, fight for our rights to re-establish those sophisticated education systems that existed within our nations. We acknowledge the hard work of our older people and what they laid down for us, and we want to continue those footsteps to re-establishing First Nations education systems within our respective nations. So it really is a lot around about nation rebuilding as well. Last year, we actually delivered a series of workshops in a few cities called Education of Our Own Design. And basically, we invited young First Nations people within Naarm, Inijing, Brisbane, up in Darwin as well, to basically have a huge discussion or yarn, basically, of how they want to, if they had the opportunity to redesign the education system, what would that look like? And it was amazing to just, collaborate and meet these amazing young First Nations people from different backgrounds and in different fields of work as well. We were hoping to run more workshops to get to other cities, but unfortunately, due to COVID this year, we weren't able to do that. But we are taking things to a virtual platform, and we're doing a yarn series. Our most recent one was about 2 weeks ago, where we basically had an open discussion with young people about their experiences in mainstream education. And that was really powerful because just to have that platform and space for young First Nations people to discuss their experiences was really, it was really quite special. And we're continuing to do more yarn series as well. Actually, we've got something exciting coming up and partnering with In My Blood It Runs, called the Learn Our Truth campaign, which is basically advocating to change or revisit the National Sarakara, to revisit their history curriculum to make sure that First Nations history is mandated in the curriculum.
Yeah, fantastic work being led by next generation leaders in education. It's just brilliant. I think of those of you who are watching have heard a breadth of knowledge that's being taught through the land, whether it's about biology, sciences, health, medicines, laws, ethics, governance, all of the things, all of the subjects that you might find in a mainstream education system exist and are embedded within First Nations knowledge systems through different pedagogies and curriculums. One of the things that we're very proud of being a partner to and helping evolve is Uchera Pampa, which is a First Nations network of first cultural educators around the country, across this country for decades and decades. People like Veronica Dobson, Felicity Hayes, MK Turner, Yama Yunupingu, incredible leaders from, as I said earlier, Papunya and the Warlpiri lands and many, many different nations who do this work in their communities every single day and are not always seen, but came together as a network. There were 15 different people from 15 different nations who came together, and many others in this growing network who will be continuing to come together in future years to lead a real push for First Nations education reform in Australia. So the work that NIAC's doing and Children's Grounds is doing is really part of a much bigger story held by many, many people beyond our organisations alone, and is being held by our elders in many places. We do believe that Australia can hold and sustain and support the First Nations knowledge systems and education systems across these lands, and that this is a very important education system to uphold. Rachel, I want to ask you about this. For us in Australia, really, we're 40 or 50 years behind other countries who have been doing this for a very long time. It's not a radical idea, really, to entertain the idea of First Nations-led education systems. So could you speak to what's happening else around the world?
I think that's right. And, in a lot of ways, Australia, in terms of First Nations issues and First Nations discussions. In a lot of ways, as a colonized country, Australia is ahead. When I first came to Australia, I used to turn on the television and the radio and the newspaper, and I used to see all these conversations around First Nations issues, and I was so shocked. You saw them like every other day in the news. You know, it's a national conversation in this country, which is amazing for a First Nations person coming from North America, where we're, you know, the Americans actually believe, I think, that Native Americans don't exist anymore. So in that way, you know, it's wonderful to see these issues as part of the national conversation, and to see so many powerful First Nations voices leading those conversations. Of course, you know, I think that one of the things that this conversation around First Nations-led education, and one of the things that the film points to, is the many powerful and wise voices on the ground that often don't get space in those national conversations. But in terms of education, and in terms of what's happening or what I've seen, and this is my perspective in Australia, is that, and as a First Nations educator from another country, you know, our reform for First Nations education in Canada, in New Zealand, in Hawaii, and in America has been going on for decades. So I'll speak to my own country, and then I'll speak to kind of the more global context for my country, my people, for the Naninaaq people. We started First Nations education reform in the 70s and 80s, and was really to push for not only the right for our children to be educated on our own country, but for our education system and structure, content, and pedagogy to be reflective of an Naninaaq educational philosophy all across the whole board. And we've been working on that since that time. And so now if you come to Alaska, you can see we have outlined and articulated, we've grown teachers. You know, there's certainly a whole lot of problems that we still have, and a lot of issues with the power imbalance, and a lot of issues with the structural system, but we have those pieces articulated, we have that work. And just to share one story, which I think connects, and I thought, you know, kept coming to mind as I was listening to the other panelists talk about how important education is to country. You know, this is something that's very common to First Nations communities all over. And for us, we're still a subsistence community, and our whole economic base is subsistence. So we still go out hunting for most of our food. And our young people grow up learning the land, learning the water, learning the way the winds, the way the currents work, learning the way the ice flows, learning how the animals operate, because we take so much of our sustenance from those lands and waters. And when we, you know, in about 20 years ago, when we started writing content for our curriculum, what we had in our school system, which was one of the best funded school systems in America, is we had our white kids, our non-Naninaaq kids, so not just white kids, but our non-native kids who were performing at the highest standard across the country, and our native kids performing at the lowest standard. So we started looking at that content, we started looking at that structure. We started creating content, which is what I see happening at Children's Ground right now, what I see happening at the work across many areas on the ground where you have First Nations people, where you have Aboriginal people who are leading those conversations. They're creating content which speak to that depth for their children. And what we saw was our children, who the ones who were struggling the most to engage with our education system, who were all of a sudden lighting up, who were all of a sudden becoming the teachers of the teachers in our systems. We saw partnerships with our Western teachers and our Native teachers in the community. We saw our elders coming into school. We saw a huge flux of resources being created and made. And we saw our children succeeding and feeling like, you know, shedding that feeling of failure that you see in the film and In My Blood It Runs. And we saw this incredible, powerful transformation that could happen for not only our children, especially for our children, but also for our communities and also for all those other practices. And that's what I see in Australia. I think that is what the communities have held the space for, the elders in all of the communities that I've ever been in this country, from the top to the south, all across the coast. That is, every single community has these incredibly powerful elders and, you know, professors, whatever you want to call them, that translates into the West, that are holding that space for their children. But I do think that because it's just starting as a national conversation in Australia, that there, you know, what has been a national conversation for these other colonized countries, where you have, you know, in New Zealand, for example, you have early childhood right through to tertiary education systems that are led by the Maori community. And same thing in Canada, right the way through, that are taught in language all the way, you know, the whole gamut and a range of those different options for communities. But Australia, we're still just starting to have this conversation on a national platform that maybe this is something we should do, that maybe this is something we should look at. And I think that, you know, I think that there is a power in that happening at this particular moment in time, because as you alluded to before, the work of Richard Pampa is quite phenomenal and fairly unique in the world. So there's a few organizations, there's a few places in the world where Indigenous educators, First Nation educators can come together, but very rarely in this conversation in any other country that I've ever worked alongside other educators with or worked with, very rarely do you have a situation where across the whole nation, you have a group of First Nation educators coming from the ground in communities. So not just, you know, the ones that are educated in the Western system who are trying to kind of bridge the gap between Western trained and Indigenous trained, but you have a combination of people who have been trained in the West, who have come to their communities, who are trying to revive these systems, and you have the strength and leadership and wisdom and complete worldview that is carried by these elders and these educators who are elders. And you have them coming together to say, let's combine our forces and combine our knowledge, and let's build this platform for our young people. And so it's a really unique opportunity that I don't think I've ever seen in any other country or place or people that I've worked with, where if Australia were to decide we're going to put our support behind the First Nations Education Collective, which is a Pampa, we're going to put our support behind those voices which are not being heard in our public policy systems right now, then you could jump through what's taken many of our other areas. You could jump through it a lot quicker, and you could see some really amazing things happen in the education space in particular for children all across this country. And as a First Nations person from another place, I'm sitting here just cheering and holding my hope and just begging Australians to kind of take this opportunity up, because it could be quite phenomenal what you see happen in the next 5 to 10 years in this country. If Australia and the Australian government and the Australian powers that be said, yes, let's actually make space at the table. Let's actually give agency back to the communities so that they can drive this. Let's actually recognize that there's an equity conversation, and Indigenous knowledge systems are just as valid and just as important for Indigenous children. And in fact, let's also push for the knowledge that it doesn't have to be a choice. It no longer has to be a choice for children. It's not a choice to be a First Nations child or a child who needs the skills in the West. They can actually have both if we allow the community themselves to come in. So that's what I think, you know, that is what I see as a First Nations educator from another country, as somebody who's been very privileged to be invited into First Nations communities across this country and to work with educators across the whole spectrum. So I'm really hoping that that's what happens in the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you. And for those of you who are watching, you know, you can find a little bit more about Uchara Pampa over time through the Children's Ground website. But really the modelling for those first cultural educators was, firstly, they want to bring more first cultural educators from the grassroots into this network, and there's more and more people connecting. And if it hadn't been for COVID, we would have progressed our face-to-face meetings there. But that this system of education that comes from the land, as Rachel's saying, spreads across these lands, across the whole of Australia, and where that's embedded in each land and each nation, it will be evolved and exercised and expressed by that nation, for where people and children live today. And in some of those places, those languages, as we say, are still alive and still being taught, and for other places across this country, those languages are resting and waiting. But that doesn't mean that First Nations knowledge systems and education systems don't continue to exist across all of these lands. And that's how Uchara Pampa sees it, that we can evolve this first cultural-led education across this country for all nations. We have maybe 5 or 10 minutes left. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and unfortunately we seem to have lost connection with Camille and Veronica. One of these questions was for her. But I might just pass it out to you, Felicity, and others. Oh, here they come, just in time. It's wonderful. I'll just wait for their audio connection to come on. Hello, Veronica. Hello, Camille. Can you hear us? Can you hear us there, Camille and Veronica?
Yes, we can.
Yeah,
Sorry,
now,
we just dropped out. The internet just dropped out completely. It's like, oh
Well, it's amazing. I was just about to ask a question and I said it was for Veronica, but she just dropped out and then you just popped back up again.
Yeah.
Perfect timing.
my God.
So the question is, and I'll also ask Felicity this question too, but I'll go to you first, Veronica. It's a particular question to you, which is, can you tell us about what you have learned being at the forefront of education reform and under education? What have you learnt after all of your experience?
So what have you learnt from being at the forefront of education, like all the work that you've done on the education?
Well, I've learned a lot, yeah.
Like?
Yeah. Yeah.
How difficult it is? Pardon? How hard it is?
Well, I suppose being at the forefront with teaching in schools as well as developing curriculums like the year 7 and 8 for the high schools. And I taught around, primary schools as well as preschools. And also we developed an early childhood program called the Yup Yup Project. And that didn't seem to get anywhere. It was, it just fell apart when we was more or less ready to disseminate, but things like that. We did the actual early childhood program out at Santa Teresa with the elders out there, and it's sitting collecting dust that you bring to school. And that was a bit of a thing for us, like it just made us think, why do we keep on, pushing to do curriculum in our languages for our kids and that. But I thought, it's only one thing that happened, but we need to continue on to make sure that our kids get an education from our own people as well, and not only English, because English is a foreign language to them, and a lot of the children don't seem to want to go to school. They might go there for a few days or so and pull out and not want to go back there again. I think, Aranda and other Indigenous languages should be taught in schools for our children to get anywhere, really, Otherwise, they'll end up just leaving school and going and not doing anything. It's good to teach in both ways, but our languages should be the first language to be taught to those kids rather than English. I think it's vital that our children need to learn from our languages first rather than English, and they can manage to learn English when they've done their own language first, or learned about their own language.
Thank you so much. It's a bit hard to continue from that to such a beautiful, really summary about what's most critically important. I'm going to just go to each of our other participants on the panel tonight before we start to close up. Camille, what final sort of comments would you like to make in relation to First Nations-led education?
I think it's been a hard road, and a lot of people have been there, and there's a lot of old people that have been fighting for this for a long time. I think that when I was working in education myself at the university, we were getting the kids that were the end product from schools. And often those kids came in and they were sort of damaged by the education system and what had happened to them in the system. And a lot of them had lots of issues around identity and, you know, had really negative views and stereotypes about Aboriginal people and, you know, Aboriginal culture. And you know, it was really sad. So we had to spend a lot of time, you know, unpacking all that and, you know, I suppose building up the self-esteem and confidence in each individual student so that they could feel pride in their culture. And I think that was the starting point for them to, you know, like build themselves a future. And there's a lot of kids that don't have that opportunity, like Aboriginal kids that walk out of schools that have been just completely disenfranchised by the school and, you know, upset and not wanting to engage and participate because that's the way they've been made to feel at schools. And, you know, people go, oh, but why are these kids behaving like this? And you go, well, maybe something to do with the schools. They keep putting it back on the parents, but often I think, you know, we spend an awful lot of time at school getting educated. And if you are disenfranchised at school, I think is a really hard thing to come back from. So, you know, we have to do something different. And I think that this isn't different. This is, you know, 60,000 years in the making, the Aboriginal education. It's been working for, you know, 60,000 years. So it's about time that we actually just went, okay, it did work. This might be a good way of, you know, enfranchising those kids and getting them back engaged in education in a really positive way. And I think that you'd see a lot more better adjusted Aboriginal people, you know, going out into the world and making their way and not ending up caught up in the system of prisons and, you know, mental health issues and all the other stuff that goes on, you know, currently with a lot of Aboriginal people. They'd be happier, more well adjusted, and I think feel more grounded in everything and feel empowered to have a say. So, you know, there is, I think, a lot of power in getting Aboriginal people, you know, involved in First Nations education and also making it something that we do just as normal practice rather than being this, you know, strange, weird little thing that people don't want to talk about.
Thank you. Yes, making it mainstream. As MK Turner says, we always talk about getting kids ready for school. Why aren't we getting schools ready for our children? So,
absolutely.
Yeah. Rachel, do you have any final comments?
I think, yes, I think that the thing to remember, and this comes from my lived experience and from my working, you know, I've been very lucky to work inside education systems now for 19 years in my own country and across Australia and with partners, as you mentioned. And I think there's a couple of things. One is, you know, this idea that our children walk into our school systems as blank slates of paper is really an antiquated idea. Our children are coming to school, and all educators that I've worked with, all good teachers that I've worked with, no matter where they come from, know this. Our children are walking into our school systems with rich tapestries of community and culture and family and language and heritage that they're bringing into the school gates. And it's our job as educators to work out how to build bridges for them through to knowledge that they need, and to work and to make sure that the knowledge that we're putting on the plate for them to get is appropriate and is relevant to what it is that they need in the world. And that's not just Western technological knowledge, right? So they definitely need Western technological knowledge. No community I've ever been in or worked with, or my community, in fact, wants their children to not have the skills that they need to operate in the West. But as you know, the panelists were saying, it is vitally important that where we start our children's educational process actually resonates with who they are, because they're not coming in, again, they're not coming as a blank slate. And in fact, you know, aside from the heart argument of that or the social justice argument of that, which are actually more important, there's a very grounded, accepted, biological, scientific understanding that actually, if we want to see children succeed in any academic area or in any academic pursuit or in any aspect of their lives, they first have to be grounded in their own culture and identity and heritage. It's only from that point that they're going to be able able to take on a second language, take on a second literary, take on extra skills that don't translate. So I think that for that to happen, and for us to see that in Australia, and in this conversation in Australia, as people who are non-Aboriginal to this country, we have to address the fact that there's a systemic bias that we have inherited in our own personal view, and work to get that off the way so that we can actually make space in our education system and every other system we work in for the communities themselves to have the agency and take the agency of running those systems, so that we don't continue to hear these stories of, we spent 20 years working on this and we did this and then it just got shut down by this government policy, or it just got shut down by that. And I think there's great power in numbers, and there's great power in interest. And I think that Australians are saying right now that they want to see that. So I think it's on all of us individually and on the systems and the work that we do to start to do work on ourselves and to start to bring that into our practice, so that we're giving power back over to the communities, so that our children are getting what they need and we can see that success. And I think that that's what we're going to see in the next 5 or 10 years. So I'm hopeful.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Renee, any final comments from you?
Yeah, I think just coming back to what I said earlier, you know, we really need to, when thinking about, you know, First Nations education system, we really need to abandon our thinking of colonial structures and systems. We really do need to rethink measurements of success. What does success actually look like for our young First Nations people? I would say that we're doing a dishonor if we're measuring them based on their literacy and numeracy, their year 10 attainment and year 12 attainment. We need to build First Nations, we need to ensure that our young First Nations people are successful learners without having to abandon their cultural identity. And I think we really need to rethink about this push for embedding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives into mainstream education. Really, it should be the other way around. We need to be embedding Western knowledge systems into our first cultural knowledge education. Thanks.
Thank you. Felicity, do you have any final comments?
To have children in mainstream classrooms, you need Indigenous people to be working with children, because they know where the children are coming from. And I think we need to teach First Nations person and Western person teaching together.
Thank you so much. Just before we close, there's a number of people are asking, what can we do? And I wanted to just sort of make the point that there are many, many things that you can do out there if you want to support and understand more. Firstly, if you haven't watched In My Blood It Runs, please do on iView, and go to the action page for In My Blood It Runs on their Facebook page. Please sign the petition that's on the Children's Ground page for the right for children, First Nations children, to have a First Nations-led education system within their own lands and countries. Please, please continue as you have tonight to build your awareness and understanding, to connect with these issues, to discuss these issues, to share with other people that you know, to bring other people in on these conversations, to know that these knowledge systems, education systems are alive and well within this beautiful country, the oldest living systems of education and knowledge across the world. If you could, you know, if you want to learn more, you can go and have a look at the Children's Ground website, have a look at WIPSI, which is the international movement for education around the world. Look at the systems in Hawaii where children have a choice to go to fully immersed education, to part immersed, to English only, but that's a choice in education system for children and education and for families. To look at what's happened in New Zealand and Māori education, in our own incredible history of people like Veronica and others who have led bilingual education, first cultural education, first language education, right through our states and territories in this country for many, many, many years. I'd ask you, if you want to, you can always support the work that we do at Children's Ground through financial donations in the Children's Ground website, which is giving the right to children to education in their first language and culture from early childhood all the way through. And remember what you are giving to your next generation of children. The role of non-First Nations people, people like myself and those of you who are watching, and the responsibilities we have to grow our next generation up, to reduce the barriers, to increase the rights, to increase the agency, and to radically reform and shift the way that we understand the status quo, because all children are brilliant. And First Nations children have these histories of knowledges and languages and teachers and educators within their first lands and cultures. For our next generation to know and to grow up with that inherent knowledge of the richness of the history in these lands, to reduce these barriers and to take on our responsibilities as non-First Nations people for the future of all children. Please stay tuned for future Children's Ground webinars. We will be working towards having a month-by-month webinar series on different topics. There's been a lot of feedback to us about the webinar series that we've been having. This particular conversation on First Nations-led education is something that will continue through the work of Children's Ground, NIAC, and many, many others who have been doing this work for many years. I want to close by thanking you all for coming tonight, for participating tonight, for being involved and engaged listeners, for giving us your time. I want to thank our wonderful, wonderful panel, our elders and our knowledge holders who are sitting on this panel, their commitment to their children, to their futures and to these lands and to our nation. And I want to remind all of us about our beautiful, wonderful, amazing children everywhere. Every single child is born brilliant. They are amazing. And it is up to us to surround them with the very, very, very best knowledge systems that are their inherent right, that look after their identity, their spirit, their languages and their cultures, and allow them to be and grow into the opportunities that should surround them and their right to be their First Nations children or from any culture that a children comes from, for that to be recognised, honoured, loved, celebrated within a global context. I thank you all again for your shared humanity and our commitment to shared social justice and human rights in this country, and look forward to seeing you again. Good night.
Hello, Regina.
Kala Rijinanga.